Welcome to All Pro Football Data. My name is Jim Coburn, and today's episode, looking at the Cincinnati Bengals draft review from 2019 to 2023 based on data. And the data we're using is approximate value stats. So I definitely am going to try to make Joe Goodbury proud for this particular episode because we're going to go through the draft. We're going to look at a lot of different things, but we're actually going to draft this based on something I don't think you can actually disagree with me on, which is how they actually performed on the football field. Because every single year you're going to have people saying, you can't grade that draft class. They haven't even played a snap yet. Well, now we are. Now we're going to grade them based on how they performed on the football field. And the way we're going to do it is we're going to look at a couple different things. One metric is called the real approximate value score. So this is how they actually performed on the football field. It's where you take the career approximate value, which is from Pro Football Reference, you divide it by the total number of seasons played to give you an average for their approximate value. And then you compare that to every single prospect from best to worst to give you the real approximate value score, which is the RAV. Then you look at the draft approximate value score. This score takes the career score from Pro Football Reference divided by total approximate value by the number of seasons played. You add all those numbers together and divide by the total number of prospects in those particular draft selections to give you the DAV. So what this does is it looks at all the prospects. So let's take pick 10. We're going to take all of the average approximate value of every single prospect taken at pick 10. We're going to get an average for that. And then we're going to compare it to every other pick to give you an idea of if you just randomly took every single player picked at pick 10, put them in a hat, reached into that hat and picked a player out, what would be that value? What would be the average value of that? What would you be most likely to get if you reached your hand in there and picked a player out? So it's a good way to kind of gauge what is expected from that draft pick based on their draft selection. And when you look at the average AV per draft range, this is where the scores are. So you can kind of see, if you picked a player from pick 1 to 5, you typically get a guy who puts up a 98 percentile draft AV, which is, a Pro Bowl, All-Pro type player. And then, of course, it goes down the line all the way down to the very end where you typically have about a 3.32 because most prospects taken down there don't really do much at all at the NFL level. A lot of that is because of how low they were picked, but that just kind of gives you that perspective there. So that is how I'm grading the picks. Typically speaking, players who score higher or players that are taken like in the 5th, the 6th round, like these low areas that do well, that become starters, kind of is what this grades, because again, we're grading the draft class. We're not grading an individual prospect. We're grading the actual class of prospects here to get the numbers that we're getting. And we're also grading it based on every single draft class since 1993. So every single class was graded from 93 until now to show us how do these players perform. Another thing to look at, which is just a little extra thing, I'm not going to talk about it too much because this deals with how I grade my prospects. So the expected approximate value score, or how I grade prospects, takes into account things like how they performed based on data, things like their age, their production, their athleticism, those different kinds of things. And what was the average score for a guy who performed 90 plus percentile in production, or 90 plus percentile in athleticism, or 90 plus percentile in age? It takes all those scores, adds them all together to give an average, and then basically gives you an idea of what their expected approximate value is based on how they tested, based on data. So that's what the EAV score does, is it shows how I would have graded them. So coming out, how would I have graded these draft classes if I just retroactively went in the past and graded them? This is essentially what this score looks at. Couple last things to bring up. Limiting factors in terms of the data. So this obviously is not going to be 100% accurate. Approximate value is, after all, not a perfect metric. It's a good general metric to use, but it's not perfect. But there are some things to kind of consider here. One, the coaching of a team can affect the development or lack of development of a prospect. So if a prospect who was not very productive at all goes to a team that has a great coach who is able to get that player to buy in, you can end up with a really great starter potentially. And then, of course, you look at things like the publicity or of the mass media market, can influence perception of a prospect. So, the media could hype up a certain prospect on a team just because he plays at a big media area, which could give them recognition that maybe they don't deserve, but because they end up on national television all the time, everybody sees their name and they make plays. They don't see the big plays that somebody else is making on a different team. I don't necessarily think that's Cincinnati's problem, but that is something that shows up on teams, like the New York Jets, the Dallas Cowboys, the LA Rams, teams that have like a lot of national publicity typically fall victim to this about their prospects. And then, of course, you have things like injury, draft status, and psychological profiles, which are also things that can influence NFL outcomes, which the data may not be able to take into account. So, with all that stuff out of the way, let's get into how they drafted based on their overall data. So the Cincinnati Bengals have been inconsistent drafters over the last 5 seasons. The Bengals finished 14 out of 32 compared to all 32 teams in that time span. If you want to know the full list, you can go to my Patreon page, patreon.com/jcoburn. And just to add a little disclaimer here, all grades are subject to change as prospects develop in the future. So these are not final grades. These grades kind of ebb and flow, kind of like a wave, if you will. They're going to go up and down and up and down, and eventually, once the players retire, they're going to get solidified. So a lot of these prospects still have time to develop. They still have time to become starters. But at the same time, you still can grade how they're doing based on how they're doing right now. So that's just the last thing to kind of bring up. So in terms of just a general view on them, as you can clearly see, the real value that the Bengals have got out of their draft classes have really only come out of the 2022 class overall and the 2020 class overall. But the 2023, 21, and 19 classes have not been that great for them. So with all that stuff out of the way, let's actually get to the actual rating of the draft classes. Starting with 2023. 2023 was middle of the pack, but that's subject to change over time. Most 2023 classes score poorly unless prospects perform well in their rookie season. The Bengals had good contributions from DJ Turner, Jordan Battle, Charlie Jones, and Chase Brown that performed on par with their draft slot. So for the most part, it wasn't a terrible class because a lot of the players they drafted kind of performed up to where they're expected to perform based on other players drafted at that same draft spot. Miles Murphy still has time to develop, but if he does, this class will also look decent long term. So again, he's only played 1 season, so we still have more time for him to develop and kind of do what he's going to become. But this is kind of how they graded out. I think the overall grade I'm going to give them is incomplete. Due to, again, this is only 1 year worth of information, so I don't think it's enough time to really kind of give them like a full-on grade for them. But I would say that if you look at the overall data for them, they are on the right track, I should say. Next up, we go to 2022. 2022 was by far their best draft class. This, of course, is subject to change over time. Cincinnati hit on par with most of their draft picks. Daxton Hill has yet to hit his expected impact yet, but Cordell Volson has emerged as a significant contributor in a less premium round. This overall draft grade since 1993 would probably be a A+. Again, this is based on every single draft since 1993, so you might disagree with this, but when you look at the players they drafted here, they're pretty much on par with what you would expect out of those prospects there. And of course, Jeff Gunter also performed pretty well despite being a 7th rounder. So if you just look at the overall draft class, they were able to get a lot out of this class in the later rounds compared to the top rounds. And that's kind of where they kind of win in this particular draft class. So again, from that perspective, that's where they really did well, from kind of like a value perspective. I know there's not a lot of sexy names out of this draft class, which we're going to see coming up, but I think the class as a whole performed pretty well from a value standpoint, which is why they got the grade that they got. Moving on to the next one. In 2021, this may be considered one of their best draft classes due to the selection of Jamar Chase, but the overall class was not on par with the averages. Out of the 10 prospects taken, only one has become a significant starter. However, the overall class of 2021 was below average based on the grading system, which is why they got an F. So you might look at the fact that, okay, why are you giving this class an F? They got Jamar Chase. And I will give you that. Based on the individual selection of Jamar Chase, the Bengals did well in 2021. But when you look at the rest of the draft class in terms of how they performed based on their real approximate value, they have not done well. So that's what you have to understand. I'm grading the actual class. Everybody in the class, people. And when you look at everybody in this particular draft class, Jamar Chase is the only one that really did well, with the exception of maybe Evan McPherson, who's a kicker. So you got a kicker and you got a wide receiver. So that is kind of how this class kind of stacks up. Again, some of you guys may disagree with this rating. How can you give them an F if they got Jamar Chase? But again, based on the grading system, based on how I explain how I grade these teams, this is kind of how they stacked up. Moving on to 2022. 2022 was the second best draft class that Cincinnati had from 2019 to 2023. Cincinnati had 3 significant starters come out of this draft class with, of course, the best prospect they've drafted in the last 5 years in Joe Burrow. This class vastly outperformed other draft classes based on impact and where the prospects were taken. The overall grade since 1993 is B+. Based on this class, Joe Burrow pretty much hit on par with what is expected of a top pick. T. Higgins outperformed his draft status. Logan Wilson outperformed his draft status. And of course, Hakeem at tackle also outperformed his draft status. So I understand a lot of you guys may be, well, why isn't this their best draft class? They got 3 significant starters out of it. Well, again, Joe Burrow, as the top pick, is performing like the top pick should perform. So you're not going to get extra points just because your quarterback ended up being a good quarterback, because that's what's expected of the top pick. And then, of course, you look at T. Higgins. Again, that's a good selection there. And, of course, Logan Wilson. But, it's a good class. It's a B+. But I think, again, when you look at the class collectively, when you leave those guys, when you leave Logan Wilson and Higgins and Burrow, you end up with a bunch of guys who have not really done much for the Bengals, based on their overall approximate value. So that is a B+ for them. And that's kind of where they shake out in terms of that. Now, the last draft class we're going to look at is the 2019 draft class, which is by far their worst class from 2019 to 2023. Jonah Williams and Jermaine Pratt became significant starters from this class. However, most of the class underperformed their draft slot. The overall grade would be an F. I know this is a hard grade, but this is just how they stacked against every single team since 1993. If you end up in the 70s, you're a C. If you end up in the 80s, you're a B. And if you end up in the 90s to 100, you're at A. So based on this particular draft class, again, Jonah Williams kind of was, based on his real approximate value, Jonah Williams has underperformed what is expected of a 11 selection. You may disagree, but based on his approximate value, he kind of underperformed. So you did get a significant starter, but you could have got a prospect that was better than Jonah Williams, based on his AV. And then, of course, you look at Drew Sample, who has not really done or lived up to his approximate value. Jermaine Pratt has outperformed his value. Ryan Finley has not. Rhino Wren has not. And, of course, Travion Williams, Deshaun Davis, Ronnie Anderson, Jordan Brown, all those guys have underperformed where they were drafted in that particular draft class. So the class as a whole has not really lived up to the expectations, in terms of their draft status. So that's kind of how this class is kind of drafted from that kind of perspective. Final thoughts. The Cincinnati Bengals draft future. I think the Bengals have shown the ability to put together some strong draft classes, and they usually come out of each class with 1 to 2 significant starters on offense, and or defense. However, they are too inconsistent to be considered one of the best drafting teams in the NFL, but they are better than most and should be excited about what 2024 might hold. So, overall, in terms of the Bengals draft classes as a whole, I think you can kind of see where they're at. Is it's not that they can't draft significant starters. They will in the future. It's just that when you look at the day 3 areas and you look at, the second round areas, they're not really hitting it out of the park in those particular areas in terms of adding guys to their team to give great value over time. So that is where they kind of ended up in terms of the draft. Again, thank you guys so much for watching. My name is Jim Coburn. You can check out my other work at Gymmetrics on Twitter at JIMETRICS. Also, check out my Patreon page, patreon.com/jcoburn. If you want to know more about the stuff that I do, if you want to learn about the draft grades themselves, if you want all that kind of stuff, definitely consider becoming a patron. It really helps out the channel a lot. I will do more of these videos in the future depending on how they do. I know this was kind of a long video and a lot of information, in it. But thank you guys so much for watching, and I'll see you guys in the next one. Peace!